A debate that was meant to humiliate Karoline Leavitt but instead backfired spectacularly. She walked into what was supposed to be a fair discussion at the New York Policy Forum, only to find herself facing a coordinated ambush. But instead of folding under pressure, she turned the tables, exposed their bias, and left the panel speechless. The New York Policy Forum at Columbia University's Grand Lecture Hall was known for high-level political debates, bringing together policymakers, journalists, and scholars for what was supposed to be rigorous, intellectual discussions. On this particular evening, the room buzzed with anticipation as one of the night's most awaited speakers, Karoline Leavitt, took her seat on the stage. Young, articulate, and unapologetically conservative, she was the lone right-wing voice on a panel stacked with progressive intellectuals. The event had been advertised as an open discussion on governance and policy, but from the moment Karoline sat down, she sensed something was off. The energy in the room wasn't one of genuine debate. It felt hostile, calculated. The panelists, led by Daniel Whitmore, a well-known progressive media commentator, exchanged smirks and knowing glances, clearly expecting an easy ideological victory. Alongside him were Dr. Evelyn Carter, a respected liberal political scientist, Marcus Reed, a senior journalist known for critiquing conservative voices, and David Langley, a former White House policy advisor turned consultant. The audience, a mix of students, academics, and media figures, leaned in, many expecting Karoline to be dismantled. As the moderator adjusted his mic, Whitmore's smirk widened. The stage was set for an ambush. What they didn't know was that Karoline was ready. The debate had barely begun when Daniel Whitmore launched the first thinly veiled attack. He adjusted his blazer, leaned forward, and gave Karoline a condescending smile, his voice thick with false politeness. "Karoline, it's always interesting to see young conservatives enter spaces like this," he began, pausing just long enough for the audience to chuckle. "Given the political climate today, do you really believe your party offers a future for people like you? Or are you just here because they need a fresh, marketable face?" The implication was clear. Karoline wasn't there because of her intelligence or qualifications, but simply because she was young, female, and conservative, a token. Before she could respond, Dr. Evelyn Carter jumped in. "Let's be honest," she said, shaking her head as if she were disappointed. "You talk about principles and policy, but isn't it true that the conservative movement has historically been resistant to progress? How do you justify being part of an ideology that, let's face it, hasn't always been welcoming to people like you?" The audience nodded and murmured in approval, the panelists exchanging pleased glances, sensing that the attack was building momentum. Marcus Reed took his turn, his tone dripping with casual mockery. "Karoline, people say you're rising in conservative circles, but let's be real. Do you actually believe in what you say, or is this just a long-term career move?" The trap was obvious. If she defended herself, they'd paint her as defensive. If she hesitated, they'd call her inauthentic. David Langley, the former White House advisor, leaned forward for what was supposed to be the final blow. "It's fascinating," he mused, "how conservatives rally behind people like you while actively pushing policies that hold women back. Don't you feel like a pawn?" The audience laughed and applauded. The ambush was in full swing. But what the panelists failed to realize was that Karoline wasn't flustered. Instead of falling into their trap, she simply tilted her head, let the moment stretch, and smiled. She was about to turn the entire conversation on its head. Karoline let the laughter fade before she responded. She didn't rush, didn't react emotionally, she just sat there, calm and composed, letting the weight of the moment settle into the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured but sharp, cutting through the air with quiet authority. "So is this a policy discussion, or am I just here for entertainment?" The panelists shifted slightly, the audience stilled, Whitmore's smirk faltered, if only for a fraction of a second. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her gaze moving between the four panelists. "Because from where I'm sitting, this isn't a debate, it's a setup." Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow, about to interject, but Karoline didn't give her the chance. "Let's be honest. You didn't invite me here to have a real discussion about policy. You invited me here to be your target. You planned the narrative before I even walked onto this stage. Every question has been framed to undermine me personally, not my ideas, not my arguments, but me as an individual. That's not debate. That's theater. The room shifted again, the energy no longer one of controlled confidence from the panelists, but an uncomfortable awareness that the audience was seeing this play out in real time. Marcus Reed, the journalist, chuckled nervously and adjusted his mic. "Come on, Karoline. This is a forum for ideas. No one's attacking you." Karoline didn't even look at him. "Really?" she asked, her tone steady. "Then let's test that. You've questioned my qualifications, my authenticity, and my motives. Tell me, have you asked my liberal counterparts on this panel the same? Have you challenged their place here, their sincerity, or does that only apply to me?" Silence. The audience, previously laughing along with the panel, was now listening differently. Some leaned forward, others exchanged sideways glances. A few people even nodded subtly. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Well, Karoline, you're in the hot seat tonight because your positions are controversial." Karoline smiled, and yet, somehow, the only thing we've talked about so far is me. Not policy, not governance, just me. She sat back, letting her words hang in the air. The setup had been exposed. And for the first time that night, the panelists looked unsure of themselves. For the first time that evening, the power dynamic shifted. Karoline's words had landed harder than the panelists expected, and the once confident smirks on their faces began to fade. Daniel Whitmore, sensing the momentum slipping away, leaned forward and forced a chuckle, trying to regain control. "Come on, Karoline," he said, his voice coated in faux amusement. "Let's not act like conservatives haven't built an entire brand off playing the victim." Karoline didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, letting a small, knowing smile creep onto her lips. "Victim?" she repeated, her tone almost amused. "Interesting choice of words, because last I checked, I'm the one being interrupted, mocked, and questioned about my mere presence here. If this is what a fair debate looks like, I'd hate to see what an ambush is." The audience laughed, not at her, but with her. A few panelists glanced at each other, realizing that for the first time tonight, Karoline had turned the audience's attention away from their narrative and onto theirs. Dr. Evelyn Carter, clearly irritated, jumped in quickly. "That's a clever deflection, but let's not pretend conservatism hasn't historically resisted progress." She waved a hand dismissively. "Whether it's civil rights, gender equality, or economic policies that actually help working-class Americans, your ideology has always been about preserving the past, not improving the future." Karoline nodded slightly, as if she'd been expecting this. "You mean the same past where liberals opposed school choice, fought against criminal justice reform, and enabled policies that hurt the very communities they claim to defend?" She let the words hang in the air before adding, "Or do we only talk about history when it suits one side?" The room fell eerily silent. Marcus Reed, desperate to regain footing, tried again. "You can't seriously believe the Republican Party is the real champion of progress." Karoline turned to him, her voice still even, unshaken. "I believe progress isn't owned by a party. It's achieved through debate. Real debate, not whatever this is." More audience members nodded. For the first time that night, the panelists weren't leading the discussion. They were trying to keep up. The defining moment of the night came when David Langley, the former White House advisor, made what he believed would be the final, crushing blow. He leaned forward, his expression calculated, and with a smug chuckle, delivered his line. "Women like you set us back. You're a pawn, and deep down you know it." The audience gasped. Even some of the panelists shifted uncomfortably, realizing the remark had crossed a line. The once confident atmosphere had turned into something tense, uneasy. Karoline's jaw tightened, not out of anger, but something deeper. She had seen this play before. She knew they weren't attacking her because they believed she was weak. They were attacking her because they were afraid. She took a deep breath, letting the moment stretch. Then, with a slow, deliberate smile, she leaned forward and delivered the line that would echo across the internet within hours. If standing up for my beliefs makes me a pawn, then so be it. But at least I'm not a puppet." The audience reaction was instant. Some gasped, others murmured, and then applause. It started with a few scattered claps, but quickly grew into something undeniable. Daniel Whitmore, usually quick with a retort, had nothing. The panel sat in awkward silence, and for the first time all evening, they looked unsure of what to do next. The moderator rushed to wrap up the segment, his voice suddenly unsteady. The cameras cut, the event concluded, but the moment? It was just beginning. Within hours, the clip hit the internet, spreading across Twitter, YouTube, and every major news platform. People across the political spectrum watched it unfold, not just conservatives, but moderates and even some liberals, who couldn't deny what they had just witnessed. The forum's reputation as an impartial platform was shattered. The hashtags began trending. Media bias, puppet, or pawn. Let her speak. Karoline had walked into an ambush. She walked out owning the entire conversation. The fallout from the debate was swift and brutal. What had started as a coordinated ambush quickly spiraled into a full-blown PR disaster for the New York Policy Forum and its panelists. Within hours of the event, the internet exploded with outrage. Conservative media outlets rallied behind Karoline, condemning the forum for blatant bias, while even some moderate and left-leaning commentators admitted that the so-called debate had been a setup. Sponsors of the New York Policy Forum quickly found themselves under fire. Viewers flooded social media, tagging companies and demanding to know why they were funding an event that had turned into a public takedown rather than an intellectual discussion. The pressure worked. Within 48 hours, several major sponsors quietly pulled their funding. Meanwhile, Columbia University itself faced backlash. Students, faculty, and alumni questioned how an institution that claimed to promote open discourse had allowed such a one-sided event to take place. The administration, previously silent, was eventually forced to release a carefully worded statement, distancing itself from the panel and vowing to review its debate policies moving forward. As for the panelists, they went quiet. Daniel Whitmore, Marcus Reed, and Dr. Evelyn Carter canceled scheduled appearances, avoiding media attention, while David Langley, responsible for the infamous "Women Like You, Set Us Back" remark, faced the harshest backlash of all. The New York Policy Forum had set out to humiliate Karoline Leavitt. Instead, they had exposed themselves. And then there was Karoline. Her career didn't just survive, it thrived. She received invitations to speak at major political conferences, interview requests from even previously dismissive media outlets, and an outpouring of support from those who saw her as a symbol of standing strong under pressure. But Karoline never gloated. She didn't need to. She had already won where it mattered most, in the eyes of the public. The New York Policy Forum debacle serves as a powerful lesson in intellectual integrity, resilience, and the unintended consequences of media bias. Karoline Leavitt walked into what was supposed to be a fair debate, only to realize she had been set up as a target. The panelists didn't seek an exchange of ideas, they sought to discredit her. However, instead of reacting emotionally or defensively, Karoline stayed composed, exposed their tactics, and turned the conversation back on them. By refusing to fall into their trap, she didn't just survive the ambush, she flipped the entire dynamic. The panelists, so used to controlling the narrative, found themselves on the defensive, revealing their bias in real time. The broader lesson: mockery and intimidation may work in controlled environments, but the truth has a way of breaking through. Audiences aren't as easily manipulated as many institutions believe. When people see unfairness, they recognize it, and public opinion can shift in an instant. Karoline's experience proves that staying calm under pressure, refusing to engage in bad faith attacks, and letting facts speak for themselves are the most powerful tools in any debate. In the end, the truth, and those who stand by it, will always come out on top.